Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Thomas Van Kampen once again, here with another episode of Let's Animate. I apologize for the other hiatus I went on. I've just been dealing with a couple of other things. Just been hanging out with friends, getting more hours at work, stuff like that. And so I'll talk about what I'm doing here. For this segment of my demo reel, I'm doing a guy just sort of dancing while he's walking down the street. When I left off, I was working on a animal morphing thing where I had a wolf morphing into a snake, morphing into a bird. As of this episode, that is finished now, and I'll be posting that in a bit. Reason I'm not posting that immediately is because I have another episode of Let's Animate in which I'm working on that, like footage of me working on that. That one I plan to do with another guest, and I'll just leave it at that for now. But for the time being, I'm just going to be showing footage of this. The idea behind this one is it's just going to be a guy dancing. At one point, he does a twirl around and stuff like that. And I just wanted to get like a front view of a guy walking down the street in an interesting way and stuff like that. And this guy's design is going to be pretty slick, pretty kind of preppy. It actually, to me, reminds me a lot of a combination between Spike from Cowboy Bebop and Sanji from One Piece. It's kind of be like that sort of thing, where it's like a slim, kind of slick tuxedo-wearing guy who's very, just very cool and stuff like that. Very laid back, very like, I don't know, maybe I'll make him a smoker or something. So, yeah. That's kind of the idea behind this character and what he's going to be doing. I'm going to be putting in the street details later down the road. So yeah, that's pretty much it for what I'm doing this episode. What I want to talk about this episode is another movie that I recently saw, which is Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. I gave my thoughts on Django in the past, and now that I've seen Quentin Tarantino's most recent movie, I'm just going to give you my thoughts on that. In my opinion, this is yet another good Quentin Tarantino film. I don't think he has a single bad film under his belt, which is quite impressive. That said, it did take me by surprise how different it was. Anybody who's expecting this movie to be reminiscent of Django just because, like, it's after the Civil War and stuff like that, they're going to be surprised, pleasantly so, if they have the same reaction as I do. Because it's the major difference between this and Django is its pacing. Django, in spite of it being a Western, which usually has pretty slow, suspenseful pace, is actually quite peppy and upbeat, and the plot moves along rather gradually. And which caught me by surprise by how like quick and witty it was. Whereas Hateful Eight is actually much slower and more brooding. That's the major difference. They're polar opposites in terms of pacing and mood, which I actually quite like. I congratulate Quentin Tarantino for wanting to do something different. I apologize if that came up on the mic. I think somebody just notified me on Facebook, but whatever. So yeah, and there's another one. Jeez. Okay, anyways, I'm getting off topic here. What I really liked about this movie is that at its heart, it's not really a Western in spite of its setting, and in spite of the fact that it will remind you a lot of Django just because of Civil War talk and talk about racism and stuff like that. It's actually not at its heart a Western. It's more of a murder mystery flick where everybody's trapped in the same cabin, and they're trying to figure out who's doing what, and nobody can be trusted and stuff like that. And, it does really well for that. Its cinematography suits the movie really well. And what's interesting is that, the cinematography suits it really well in that it makes the cabin seem very small and compressed, and it makes everybody feel like they're way too close for comfort. And yeah, and it made me think like this movie, with the exception of like the first few chapters, this movie is segregated in chapters, by the way. With the exception of the first two chapters, I think this movie could very well be done as a stage play because everything's in the same room, more or less. Um, and yeah, I think that's really cool. And all the characters are really interesting and mysterious. Every character has. The movie is very appropriately titled Hateful Eight because every character in this movie has something to hate about them. Everybody in this movie is despicable somehow, and it makes you feel like everybody has something to hide. Everybody has motive for doing what they're doing, and it's really cool in that regard. And like it keeps you on the toes for the big mystery. That said, it is a mystery movie, and in my opinion, the big reveal behind the whole mystery is a bit of a cheat, and I'll explain why without giving out any spoilers. Um, Typically, a murder mystery's job is to give the audience subtle hints along the way so that they can come to their own conclusions on what the big reveal is, and they can find out later in the movie if they were right the whole time. So it's basically allowing the audience to play detective for a bit. And this movie tries to do that and does well for the most part. But the actual twist is not something that like is particularly hinted towards. It's actually the big twist relies on something that wasn't conveyed to the audience in any subtle fashion, which I think is a big flaw for a mystery movie because like how could have the audience have seen that coming? Like I feel like the conclusion to a mystery movie should have been something that when an audience sees it they think like, "Oh, how did I not think of that? That's so obvious, blah blah blah." But this movie has just sort of this thing that's kind of revealed at the last second, and it just made me feel like it just made me say to myself, well, how the heck was I supposed to know that? But yeah, that's a minor gripe with the movie, and I don't blame Tarantino for doing something like that because this is like the first murder mystery he's really done, and so it makes sense that like that would kind of be something that kind of slips past him, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I did only see it once, so maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe they actually did hint more towards it than I initially thought. But yeah, I just kind of thought that was a cheap, like a cheat for the audience. But whatever. Another thing is that it was much slower paced than. Okay, the slow pace doesn't bother me, but it does drag on a bit in certain areas, more so than is necessary, I feel. I mentioned when I was talking about Django how I was expecting it to drag a little bit because it's 2 hours and 45 minutes, and typically westerns tend to drag a bit. And I was surprised by Django to find out that it's actually a much quicker pace than I anticipated. But Hateful Eight is much different in that it is very slowly paced, and sometimes like it just has some bits of unnecessary like just kind of standing around and stuff like that. And I'm just sitting there waiting for the plot to get going. I don't know. It's very laid back in that sense, but like I feel like a lot of what happens just sort of happens for no reason because like it accomplishes the exact same effect later on. But yeah. That said, what really struck me with this movie is its elements of horror suspense. It has this soundtrack that's very eerie, and it's actually very reminiscent of something you would hear in a Hitchcock film, where it's kind of slow and suspenseful, and then it just kind of catapults into this big thing with kind of like this eerie instrument playing and stuff like that. I think that was really cool. It reminds me of like a lot of horror suspense in that regard. Um, so yeah. But that said, even though this is very different from a lot of what Tarantino has done in the past, it's still very much at its heart a Tarantino flick. It's still got plenty of gore. It's still got lots of crass humor behind it. But that's mostly reserved for the second half. The first half is more laid back and more exposition than anything else, where you're just kind of chilling out with these characters. And once the mystery starts to get going, and more things are revealed for themselves, that's when the bloody stuff really comes in. Um, and yeah, and it more than makes up for its slow second half because the gruesome stuff in this movie is very gruesome, even for Tarantino standards, I think. Um, but yeah, that's sort of what struck me as the most interesting behind it is the fact that it's much more slower paced than a typical Tarantino film, uh, which is usually sort of like at a brisk kind of like it. It's hard to explain how a Tarantino film is usually paced. Point being, it's just a lot slower and more brooding and more eerie than a typical Tarantino flick is, which I thought was really refreshing for the most part. I thought it was a pretty cool thing. Um, yeah, and it has some typical Tarantino cast members in there. It's got Sam Jackson once again, who is a recurring character in a lot of Tarantino films. And it's got Christopher Waltz, who was Dr. Schultz in Django. And they both do a spectacular job. Everybody in this movie does a great job portraying their characters. Everybody has a lot of personality to them, which clashes with everybody else's. Character interaction feels authentic, yeah, and it really makes you feel like you're trapped in this cabin with these people. And I know I talked about the cinematography before and how well it kind of captures the idea of a tight enclosed space, but there's this really cool take on a typical Tarantino shot in this movie where a lot of times when it comes to indoor shots in a Tarantino flick, he'll have like one instance of a shot that's like kind of coming down from the ceiling. Tarantino does that a lot in his flicks. He's done that in Kill Bill. He's done that in what do you call it? He does like sort of a pan shot in Django, where the closer it gets to the ceiling, the more guys with guns are revealed on screen. Here it's cool because it's panning across the room as these guys are walking towards this other guy, and you see like the railings and the suspension of the ceiling as it's going, and it's covering a bit of the frame. I think that's super cool and just gets across more how tightly compressed this place is. And yeah, it's really cool in that regard. Um and there's another good twist on a Tarantino shot. Like Tarantino has a lot of like classic shots that he puts in his movies, what I just mentioned, as well as like sort of this POV shot from in the trunk or something like that, where a sort of door opens and as kind of looking up towards a character who's reacting to something, usually laughing or something like that. Like there's a trunk shot like that in Reservoir Dogs where they're keeping a guy in a trunk, and when it's revealed, everybody's sort of smiling at him. And they do that same thing for the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, where and in Pulp Fiction's case, what's actually in the briefcase isn't really revealed. Um, in Hateful Eight, there's a scene where a guy is trying to find another guy, and he finds him with his like blood tracks or whatever, and he opens the door, and it's the door to like this I don't know what it is, like a storage closet outside or something like that, and it's really cool. It has a lot of Tarantino isms in there, but they have much more of a twist behind them than usual, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, overall, I thought it was a really good movie. I don't think it would necessarily be my favorite of Tarantino's films, but I do appreciate how unique it is. And while I do have, admittedly, more problems with it than I do with Tarantino's usual flicks, I do appreciate it for taking more risks in different regards than a typical Tarantino film would, and I just overall think it's really enjoyable. Something I thought about doing is Tarantino has mentioned in a couple of interviews of his that he's just going to make 10 movies and then he's going to be done. He's going to move on to other things like playwriting and novel writing and stuff like that. And it's worth mentioning that Hateful Eight is Tarantino's eighth movie. So he has two more movies after this and then he's done, according to him. And I'm thinking that since that's probably going to happen, Tarantino seems like he's pretty serious about that. If that happens, what I'd like to do, and I imagine other people have thought of this already, is I would like to do a top 10 Tarantino films where I kind of pay a tribute to him and I rank his movies from 10 to 1 in terms of quality. And yeah, and maybe other people have had that idea already. I think that would be an especially interesting thing to do, to kind of pay tribute to how much he influenced filmmaking. And yeah, um, and yeah, I just really liked Hateful Eight. I don't know what else to say about it. It's just a really good flick. Check it out if you haven't already, especially if you're a Tarantino fan. You will not be disappointed. And I'd like to bringing back to this project I'm working on here. I think it's appropriate how I'm talking about Tarantino in this episode because I mentioned earlier that this character's design is sort of reminiscent of Spike from Cowboy Bebop and Sanji from One Piece. And I think that's appropriate for the Tarantino discussion because both of those characters, fun fact, are influenced by characters from Reservoir Dogs. So Spike is just generally supposed to be that sort of thing, while Sanji more specifically is influenced by Steve Buscemi's character, Mr. Pink, in Reservoir Dogs, which I've always thought is really cool. And every time I see Sanji, I immediately think Steve Buscemi, which is quite funny. Yeah. Man, I still got quite a bit of time. I sort of thought the Hateful Eight discussion would really use this episode up. Other than that, haven't been up to a whole lot. I mentioned in a rant video that I posted last night at like 1 o'clock in the morning that there's apparently going to be a Shining remake, which I find especially insulting. Not a remake. I keep saying remake in that video, but more to the point, it's actually supposed to be a confirmed sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. You can go watch that video. I'll probably post a link in the description. I don't really want to talk about it here because I've said everything that I wanted to say in that video, but I'm just trying to use up the time here. So, yeah, I think that's all I'm going to cover for this episode. Thank you guys so much for joining me once again on this episode of Let's Animate. I'll try to upload more consistently this week. Hopefully I don't shoot myself in the foot by saying that. Point being, thanks for sticking with me, and I hope you'll join me for the next video. Okay, see you later.